palace of Akkad, where a foundling rescued from the Euphrates had become the world's first emperor, the vision of unified humanity had achieved its first great expression. But empires, like the mortal men who create them, do not last forever. As Sargon's dynasty faded and competing powers arose throughout Mesopotamia, a new challenge emerged that would test everything civilization had learned about justice, authority, and the delicate balance between order and freedom. Along the banks of the Euphrates, where trade routes converge and caravans pause to rest before continuing their journeys, a modest city called Babylon was quietly preparing to transform the very nature of law itself. The morning mist rose gently from the Euphrates as it flowed past the walls of Babylon, 1800 years before Christ. To travelers approaching from the north, the city appeared unremarkable, another of the many urban centers that dotted the Mesopotamian landscape. Its mud brick walls and modest ziggurats, distinguishable from dozens of similar settlements, only by the exceptional number of merchant caravans that gathered at its gates. But appearances deceived. Behind those unremarkable walls, in the palace chambers where King Hammurabi held court, one of history's most revolutionary experiments in governance was taking shape. An attempt to codify justice itself, to transform the arbitrary decisions of individual rulers into universal principles that would apply equally to all citizens, regardless of their wealth, status, or personal connections to power. Hammurabi had not inherited a great empire like Sargon's descendants. Instead, he had received a modest kingdom centered on Babylon, a city whose greatest advantage lay not in military might or agricultural wealth, but in its strategic position at the crossroads of Mesopotamian trade. Here the great river routes that connected the Persian Gulf to the northern mountains intersected with overland paths that carried goods between the eastern highlands and the western deserts. This geographic advantage had made Babylon prosperous, but prosperity brought its own challenges. The city attracted merchants, craftsmen, and administrators from throughout Mesopotamia, creating a cosmopolitan population whose diverse backgrounds and conflicting interests strained traditional methods of maintaining social order. Laws that worked for homogeneous communities of farmers or herders proved inadequate for urban societies, where strangers conducted business across cultural and linguistic boundaries. As a young king, Hammurabi had resolved these conflicts through personal judgment, hearing disputes in the traditional manner of Mesopotamian rulers, who served as both temporal authority and divine intermediary. But as Babylon grew and his kingdom expanded through careful diplomacy and selective warfare, the burden of individual case-by-case justice became impossible for any single person to bear. The solution Hammurabi devised would transform legal thinking for millennia to come. Instead of relying on royal discretion to resolve each dispute, he would create a comprehensive legal code that established consistent principles for all categories of conflict that arose in complex urban societies. These laws would be written down in cuneiform script, publicly displayed where all citizens could reference them, and enforced by judges who served royal authority but were bound by legal precedent rather than personal preference. The process of creating this legal code required unprecedented scholarly effort. Hammurabi's scribes collected legal precedents from throughout Mesopotamia, studying the judgments that previous rulers had made in similar cases, and identifying patterns that could be generalized into universal principles. They analyzed commercial disputes to understand what standards of fairness merchants from different cultures could accept. They examined family conflicts to determine how traditional relationships should be balanced against individual rights. Most importantly, they grappled with the fundamental question that underlies all legal systems. What is the purpose of justice? Is law meant primarily to punish wrongdoing, to compensate victims, to deter future crimes, or to maintain social stability? Hammurabi's answer, preserved in the prologue to his Great Code, established principles that continue to influence legal thinking today. To bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, the code proclaimed, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that I should rule over the people and enlighten the land, to further the well-being of mankind. Justice was not mere punishment, but a positive force that protected society's most vulnerable members while establishing conditions where all citizens could prosper. The code itself, carved onto a massive stele of black basalt that stood over 7 feet tall, contained nearly 300 individual laws covering every aspect of Mesopotamian urban life. Property rights were specified in detail, establishing clear procedures for buying, selling, and inheriting real estate, livestock, and personal possessions. Commercial law addressed the contracts that made long-distance trade possible, specifying the responsibilities of merchants, the standards for weights and measures, and the procedures for resolving disputes that arose when business partners were separated by hundreds of miles. Family law occupied a central position in the code, reflecting Hammurabi's recognition that stable households provided the foundation for stable societies. Marriage contracts were regulated to ensure fair treatment of wives while protecting the property rights of husbands and children. Divorce procedures balanced the need for family stability against the reality that some marriages could not succeed. Inheritance laws specified how property should pass from one generation to the next, preventing the disputes that could tear families apart and disrupt economic relationships. But perhaps most revolutionary were the code's provisions addressing what we would now call criminal law, those offenses that threatened not just individual victims, but the stability of society itself. Here Hammurabi's legal thinking revealed both the sophistication and the limitations of ancient concepts of justice. The principle of proportional punishment, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that became associated with Hammurabi's code, represented not primitive vengeance, but a revolutionary limitation on retaliation. In earlier times, disputes between individuals or families could escalate into blood feuds that consumed entire communities. By specifying that punishment should match rather than exceed the original offense, the code established legal boundaries that prevented minor conflicts from destroying social peace. Yet the code also reflected the social hierarchies that characterized Mesopotamian civilization. Penalties for crimes committed against nobles were more severe than those for identical offenses against commoners. Slaves received different treatment under law than free citizens. Women's legal rights, while protected in many circumstances, were generally subordinated to male authority within families and communities. These inequalities, troubling to modern sensibilities, represented significant advances over earlier systems where justice depended entirely on social status and personal connections. For the first time in human history, written law established minimum standards of treatment that applied even to society's most powerless members. Slaves could not be killed arbitrarily by their masters. Women retained property rights that survived marriage and divorce. Even the poorest citizens could appeal to royal justice when wronged by the wealthy and powerful. The public display of the law code on its massive stone stele served purposes beyond mere information. It was placed in the courtyard of Babylon's main temple, where citizens gathered for religious festivals and commercial business. The visible presence of written law reminded everyone that justice was no longer subject to the whims of individual rulers, but governed by principles that transcended personal authority. The stele itself was a masterpiece of Mesopotamian art as well as legal scholarship. At its top, carved in detailed relief, King Hammurabi stood before Shamash, the sun god who governed justice and truth. The divine figure, seated on a throne and radiating the light that revealed all hidden things, extended to the mortal king the rod and ring that symbolized royal authority to establish law and maintain order. This artistic representation embedded profound theological claims within the legal code. Hammurabi's authority to establish law derived not from conquest or inheritance alone, but from divine appointment to serve cosmic justice. The laws carved below this scene were not arbitrary human regulations, but earthly expressions of eternal principles that governed the universe itself. To violate these laws was to rebel not just against royal authority, but against the divine order that sustained all existence. The practical impact of Hammurabi's code on daily life in Babylon and the territories that acknowledged his authority was immediate and far-reaching. Merchants could enter into contracts with confidence that disputes would be resolved according to consistent standards, rather than the personal prejudices of individual judges. Craftsmen could invest time and effort in perfecting their skills, knowing that legal protection of property rights would allow them to profit from their innovations. Families could plan for the future, confident that inheritance laws would protect their children's interests. Women gained legal standing that, while limited by the standards of their time, provided security and protection that had previously depended on the goodwill of male relatives. Even slaves received legal protections that, however minimal, established their humanity within a system that had previously treated them as mere property. The administrative machinery required to enforce this legal code drove innovations in governmental organization that influenced political development throughout the ancient world. Courts were established in every major city within Hammurabi's kingdom, staffed by judges who received specialized training in legal interpretation and procedure. Scribal schools expanded their curricula to include legal education, producing the professional administrators needed to maintain consistent application of complex regulations across diverse territories. Record-keeping systems preserved the details of legal proceedings, creating archives that served both as precedents for future cases and as evidence of how justice was actually administered throughout the kingdom. These administrative records, thousands of which have survived on cuneiform tablets, provide detailed insights into how ancient legal systems functioned in practice rather than merely in theory. The influence of Hammurabi's code extended far beyond the boundaries of his own kingdom. Through the trade networks that connected Mesopotamia to the broader ancient world, merchants who learned Babylonian legal procedures carried this knowledge to other cities and regions, spreading concepts of written law and consistent justice throughout the civilized world. Legal scholars from other kingdoms traveled to Babylon to study the code and its implementation, adapting its principles to local conditions and cultural traditions. The idea that law should be written down, publicly displayed and consistently enforced became a standard expectation of civilized government, influencing legal development from Egypt to India. But perhaps most importantly, Hammurabi's code established the principle that justice was not simply the will of whoever held power, but a separate standard that even rulers were obligated to serve. This concept, revolutionary in its implications, created intellectual foundations for later developments in political theory that would challenge absolute monarchy and establish concepts of limited government and individual rights. The code's influence on religious thinking was equally profound. By presenting law as divine revelation mediated through human institutions, Hammurabi's legal philosophy provided a model for later religious traditions that would see written scripture as binding divine command that limited rather than enhanced the arbitrary authority of religious leaders. As evening settled over Babylon, as oil lamps flickered to life in the courts and administrative offices throughout the kingdom, something unprecedented had been achieved in human governance. Justice itself had been captured in written form, preserved in stone and parchment, where it could survive the death of individual rulers and guide the decisions of their successors. In the temple courtyard, where the great stele stood, silhouetted against the star-filled Iraqi sky, citizens could approach the monument that had transformed their relationship to authority itself. No longer were they subjects whose fate depended entirely on royal whim or personal connections to power. They were participants in a legal system that, however imperfect, acknowledged their humanity and provided mechanisms for protecting their legitimate interests. The revolution in legal thinking that Hammurabi had initiated would continue to evolve long after his death, influencing every subsequent attempt to organize complex societies according to principles of justice rather than mere force. Legal codes based on his precedent would emerge throughout the ancient world, each adapting his insights to local conditions while preserving the fundamental insight that civilized government required written law consistently applied. Under the eternal stars that had witnessed the rise of cities, the development of writing, the conflicts between city-states, and the creation of empires, the people of Hammurabi's kingdom rested peacefully in communities governed by principles that balanced authority with justice, order with fairness, the needs of society with the rights of individuals. The code carved in stone would outlast the kingdom that created it, speaking across millennia to every generation that struggled with the eternal human challenge of living together in justice and peace. Tomorrow would bring new legal disputes, new challenges to the balance between competing interests, and the slow, patient work of refining the principles that made civilized life possible. But tonight, in the shadow of the Great Steel, where divine authority had been translated into human law, the foundations of legal civilization had been established with a permanence that would influence human society until the end of time. Our journey through the corridors of time continues as the principles of justice established at Babylon inspire new forms of political organization throughout Mesopotamia. Discover how the harsh northern lands of Assyria forge a different approach to empire, one built on military discipline, administrative efficiency, and the systematic cultivation of power that will dominate the ancient world for centuries. The Iron Masters of Ashur await,